The international response to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine remains inadequate to the task. And today we're going to be discussing four possible outcomes of that full-scale war. And of course, we need to touch upon the election victory of President Trump, who will start to transition into the position to take over from Biden's administration. But today's discussion is going to be based on a remarkable and deeply fascinating report produced by Chatham House. I'm delighted to have the author of that report joining me today, John Lough. He's an associate fellow of the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House and head of international at the New Eurasia Strategy Centre, a London-based think tank. Well, there's plenty more stuff in his biography. As you'd expect, I'm going to put all of that in the description of the video so you can read that. But for now, we are going to jump straight into the report because it contains some incredibly pertinent topics to what is happening at the moment. John, could you briefly describe to me why you felt it was so important to write this report and at this particular time?
Jonathan, thank you firstly for the invitation. Secondly, for reading the report. The report has a little bit of history, and I can be absolutely open about this, that I was asked about a year ago by a department in the UK Ministry of Defence to put my mind to the issue of how things might look in Ukraine when the war comes to an end. And I was really quite pleased to find out that there were people thinking this far ahead in the British system, because I think it's just important to look beyond the, if you like, the fog of war and try to understand the bigger picture that's emerging. So I embraced this challenge, and I have to say it's one of the more difficult papers that I have written over the years. I made several trips to Ukraine to talk to people on the ground, not just in Kiev, to try to gain just an impression of what the war was doing to the country. And sometimes you've got to look beyond, the daily headlines, horrifying as they sometimes are, and think about the broader impact on people's lives, on the economy, on the futures they see for themselves. And I have to say, some of it was a little bit overwhelming, really. And you're in contact with people's raw emotions and all these things. So I had to sit back for a while and digest that. And I wrote up a report for the Ministry of Defence. And they said to me that we are, happy for you to publish the report. And I left it for a little bit and came back to it, and I felt with my colleagues at Chatham House over the summer that it was time to get it ready for a launch in the autumn. So I think the terms of timing, we actually ended up with something quite favourable, because there's obviously in recent weeks been a lot of discussion about the possibilities for some peace negotiations starting between Russia and Ukraine.
And I
And
know
I'm
from,
pleased to say that
sorry.
the paper, sorry to interrupt, the paper has attracted some interest in Ukraine as well, because Ukrainians, I think they find it important to have this outside view.
Well, that's of course deeply fascinating because if the Ukrainians are paying attention, then there's certainly going to be something of value in that report. Um, is this a process you think that is underway in various capitals of Europe and the US, or do you get the impression that not enough thinking is being done about what Ukraine is going to look like after the war, but also what Russia is going to look like? Not that we may be able to control that, but defining the kind of Russia that we would want to see and the kind of traits that we would not want to see in that area.
That's a very good question. I think broadly speaking, there has been far too little thinking going on about, first of all, the severity of the situation in which we find ourselves, let alone about what's going to happen when we get to the next stage. And I think the problem is that when you are in the middle of a war, as we are, and I use the term we here because Western governments really want to try to distance themselves from this terrible war in Ukraine, but we are in this war indirectly, but we are directly in the Russians' sights in that they want to, upend the European security system and reformat it with the rules written in Moscow. And I think when I speak to government officials, not just in the UK, but elsewhere in Europe and indeed in the United States, the overriding impression I have is that their absolute key focus is to keep Ukraine going. And this becomes how do we do this, for the next 3 months or the next 6 months? I saw somebody from the State Department recently at a conference who was saying that, before the Biden administration leaves, they want to put Ukraine in a position where it can carry on maybe for even as much as a couple of years. Now, I think that's a very ambitious objective, given how little they've given. But when that becomes your main focus, just to sustain Ukraine, that almost sort of replaces the strategy, because there is no strategy. We've never really said what we want as the outcome from this war. We talk about as long as it takes, we're there, but nobody wants to define what it actually means. Is it a Ukrainian victory? If it is a victory, then what form does that victory take? What's a reasonable outcome? All the time, really since the start of the war in February 2022, we've tried to, I think, sort of play this game of saying we'll give the Ukrainians as much as we can at the moment, in the hope that somehow this is all going to resolve itself. Putin will find that he can't carry on fighting without doing his country great damage. The Ukrainians will conclude that some deal has to be done and the two will meet. But I don't see much sign of that right now, even though President-elect Trump has ideas about how fast he can end this war. Bringing this war to an end is going to be such a huge challenge, and it cannot be done over the heads of the Ukrainians. So I think we are going to see some efforts over the coming probably weeks and months to see whether the Russians are prepared to enter a discussion with the US. And there are certain things that Putin wants from the US, namely an assurance that Ukraine will never join NATO, for example. But President-elect Trump is, as we know, a man with very strong transactional instincts. And the question is, what is he going to receive in return from Putin? And there, I'm very unsure about what Putin can really give. But we can maybe get onto this it's a broader subject as our conversation develops.
Absolutely. I think that is a fascinating area. So in a minute, we'll come to the four scenarios or the four potential outcomes. But I'm fascinated by this question of whether the Trump campaign win changes any of this calculus. It seems to me, and it'd be interesting to hear, especially as you've been to Ukraine recently and had these in-depth conversations, it seems that the Ukrainian strategy has been building up to this moment, that perhaps it is not such a huge shock and surprise as it seems to have been for so many others that Trump is the next president. You have the Kursk incursion, which achieves a number of things, not least it makes it far more difficult to just throw Ukraine out of the bus or create a sort of instant ready mix peace. It makes that far, far more complex. And that may have been part of the calculus. And then this extraordinary statement by Zelensky saying, look, it's either NATO or nukes. The implication perhaps is that maybe both are required for future Ukrainian security. How far do you think he had this election in mind with both of those events that have been unfolding over the last 6 months, and in mind that Trump may very well be the person that he has to deal with?
Well, let me say briefly, I think it's been a very difficult few months for President Zelensky and his team, because their relationship with the United States has steadily deteriorated. They have lobbied so strongly for the United States to do more, to allow them to use some US weapons to strike targets over the border in Russia. The Biden administration was constantly telling the Ukrainians they didn't want this war to escalate, and therefore they didn't want to get more deeply involved. And by ruling out things that they could quite easily have done or allowed the Ukrainians to do, in effect, they allowed Putin to escalate and to increase the pressure on the Ukrainian defense forces in Donbass. And the Russians are steadily advancing. relatively slowly at absolutely massive cost, human cost. I mean, in terms of the losses on their side, losing up to 30,000 men a month in killed and seriously wounded. So these are enormous losses. The Ukrainians, I think, if they're honest with themselves, they know very well, better than we do, that because of the relative inaction and I would say lack of imagination, indeed boldness on the part of the West and particularly the United States, they are in a position where they are losing this war slowly and painfully. And at the end of 2022, as the late 2022, as the Russian forces were being forced back at huge speed by the Ukrainian army, there was an opportunity to, I believe, inflict a defeat on the Russian army in Ukraine. That moment passed when the Russians were given time to build defenses, which no NATO army could easily overcome, and the Ukrainians certainly couldn't on their own. So Zelensky has been in this position where I think he hasn't had any good option looking at him, from the United States, because it's been either some continuation of the Biden line, this sort of incrementalism that doesn't give Ukraine enough, where Ukraine fights with one hand tied behind its back, or it's being at the mercy of Trump, where you don't know what might possibly happen. Is he going to just sort of give the country away to the Russians, or is he going to conclude that if he does that, he looks weak in front of particularly the Chinese, and that he turns around and says, you know what, Biden was weak, and I'm going to show you how to do this, and we're going to arm the Ukrainians properly. I mean, I do seriously think a non-standard, if you like, scenario of that kind is entirely possible because Trump is so volatile. And that's certainly something the Russians are very concerned about. They found it easy to read to read Biden and his team, but they didn't get much out of Trump the first time round during his first term. In fact, he did. I mean, for the record, it has to be said he was the first U.S. president to supply lethal aid to the Ukrainians. He gave them these Javelin missiles. Under his term, during his first term, the whole bunch of sanctions were introduced against Russia. So I think the Russians were, having been rather exuberant when he was first elected, were somewhat disappointed by his performance. Is it going to be any different this time? Well, quite possibly. So it's very difficult to place bets here.
And that's one of the interesting angles, isn't it? I know we're a little bit sort of off the core topic, but people who are, let's say, expounding Russian narratives have certainly come close to the inner circle of Trump. You have Tucker Carlson, you have Trump Jr., you have the Kennedy chat, and there are discernible patterns of Russian narrative there. Much of it absolutely, doesn't align with reality in any way whatsoever. But Trump himself seems to make decisions on the spur of the moment. He seems to make decisions based on, as you say, factors which you cannot plan for or necessarily expect. But he also has a fragile and sensitive ego. And I was talking with Stephen Moore about this, that actually one of the things that could happen is Putin tries to humiliate Trump, and that doesn't go down well. And he gets a response that he's not expecting because, as we saw the Tucker Carlson interview, Putin couldn't help but try to humiliate Carlson in front of him. And being a sort of propagandistic lackey, he just sort of put up with that. I'm not sure Trump would necessarily do that if he was put into the same corner.
I certainly don't think he would tolerate that. But on the other hand, I think Putin is smart enough to know that he shouldn't do that. And for that reason, he'd probably be rather scared of this, interaction with Trump. But he has the confidence, of course, that he was able, it seems, to manipulate him to some extent. Remember the famous Helsinki encounter where, I mean, I think if I remember that press conference, that was a horror show for Trump's officials, at least those people who really cared about the dangers posed by Russia. To hear the U.S. president say, "I don't trust the CIA. I'll take what Putin's telling me about issue X." I tend to think that this time round, much as Trump admires Putin, his capacity for self-admiration must have grown extraordinarily over the last 24 hours. And I mean, let's face it, this is the most phenomenal comeback. And for a man of 78 to achieve this, who was, written off and his criminal conviction and, all those things, and it's some form of evil genius, in my view, this ability to simply sense what an electorate wants and to be able to attract a certain element of that electorate to be your passionate supporters, and for that message to spread, all the way to Wall Street. It is something that the man is, for his many manifest faults, he is something of a phenomenon. And this success, I'm sure, is going to redefine politics, not just in the United States, but elsewhere.
And to make so many
So
mistakes that would have written off any other candidate, even individually, and still bounce back. Well, let's turn to the report because you've outlined four scenarios: the long war, the frozen conflict, victory for Ukraine. That one, of course, is difficult to understand how there's a path to that at this point, and then there's outright defeat. Why these four alone? Are there any other scenarios following the election that could be under consideration? And could you give a breakdown of each of those four? Um, and I'm guessing each of them come with a certain probability. Some may be more likely than others, or may have certain dependencies and contingencies if they were to come about.
Okay, Jonathan, I'm not going to be drawn into the predictions game very easily. In fact, I said in the paper that this is not the purpose of the paper to predict, but rather to outline what I think the possible outcomes are. And I mean, if we go down the list, the one the Ukrainians fear most, in fact, is the long war, where the country is inadequately resourced, but has to continue fighting, and the losses, the human losses, economic losses, sort of mount up to the point where, over time they just really can't sustain it, and then the integrity of the country is truly at stake, and maybe its future as a going concern would be imperiled. The solution that I think in recent times and probably up to now, and particularly boosted by uh, Trump's victory, you could consider much more likely is the possibility of some, shall we say, negotiated settlement. And the Ukrainians tend to call this a bad peace, where they'll be forced to give up some territory. There'll be obviously a big discussion about the security arrangements for the territory that's not occupied by Russia. How this is going to work, and they think there's going to be some sort of replica of the agreements that emerged in late 2014, early 2015, the so-called Minsk agreements, which were some kind of really, they were largely written in Moscow, and the purpose was in the form of a poison pill to reinsert the territories that had been taken away from Ukraine's control by Russian proxies and with the help of the Russian army, by the way, and then reinsert them into Ukraine with certain constitutional and other arrangements that would have undermined the ability of the country to effectively retain sovereign control of its future and make decisions about its security orientation, all those sorts of things. And I mean, fortunately for Ukraine, those agreements were so badly written that it was possible to interpret them in different ways, and the implementation really became impossible. And the Russians played a sort of waiting game, got a bit distracted, in my view, in Syria. But then most of us felt who were dealing with Ukraine recognized that for Putin, Ukraine was still very much unfinished business, and they would then have another go at trying to achieve their goals. But I don't think anybody could have forecast that Putin would go the whole way and simply go for the option of a full-scale invasion. I think you had to say it was always possible, but the likelihood of that was relatively low. And we still don't know exactly what it was that pushed him over the edge and what his officials told him or didn't tell him. But maybe the historians of the future will find out. So the concern there, obviously on the Ukrainian side, is that you end up with some kind of fake peace, and it's just actually a chance for the Russians to sort of get their breath again, and then they'll come back for more. I mean, it has to be said, I think that both sides are tired in their own ways. It's not going swimmingly well on the Russian side, despite the daily reports we see of territorial advances in the east of the country. But the Ukrainians are hurting badly for very obvious reasons, that they've lost a lot of people. Economically, things are very tough. They've lost what 50% of their peak power generation capacity, thanks to Russian drones and missiles. This winter is going to be very tough for them, but they don't show at this stage any sign of caving in. But I think you have to say, in a year's time, if we're still in the same position, then I would fear about Ukraine's just ability to sustain this level of resistance. So you could say time is on Putin's side, but I'm not sure it's quite as simple as that. There
And there's the
are
Russian
problems in the
economy
armed
too, isn't there?
forces.
I mean, the Russian economy is probably
Yeah, the
a
economy, I
topic for
think,
a separate discussion, but it doesn't seem to be in a great condition.
it's not in a great condition, and it's been now heavily militarized, which gave an initial spike in GDP. But I think they can carry on for a bit. But the really big question that some experts, military experts, are asking is just how long they can sustain this level of losses on the battlefield. When they've got to replace 4,000 tanks and probably a similar number of infantry fighting vehicles. They're doing this at the moment by producing some of them, but also taking a lot of them that have been in store from the old days. So this is pretty old equipment. If they go on at these rates, they are going to burn through that in 18 months. And then you'd have a question of, can they actually produce the kit they need to continue fighting at this level? And there are other problems in the Russian army itself, and numbers of soldiers, the numbers of officers they've been losing during the war, very, very high. So they don't have an interest in this going on indefinitely. But I think the problem is that Putin sees a prize. And the prize is, of course, control over Ukraine's destiny. If he were to achieve that, then that would be a further humiliation of the United States, and particularly NATO. And then I think you get into a big question about just the cohesion of the Western alliance, as we used to call it. It might just be there on paper, but not capable of very much. So that I think is what he sees as the big opportunity. So this is much more than just a quest for more territory in Ukraine. It's the destiny of Ukraine, and with it, I think the cohesion of this Western security order. Is it really going to continue to be a force to be reckoned with? And now you have I suppose the added addition of Trump and his instincts to his skepticism, at the very least, for NATO, the European Union, institutions of this kind that have provided for European security, and ultimately have, I think, served the US extremely well. But he seems to be ready to downgrade, particularly US contribution to NATO, and that's going to have, I think, all sorts of consequences.
From
So
various
the third
conversations,
scenario.
yes, sir. I mean, there's other two options there, but I wanted to dig into that one particularly because out of all the different scenarios, the sort of rumblings I hear coming from sort of Berlin and Brussels is that this idea of freezing the lines of contact, um, is the one that's actually favored. It's the one that's a real focus of a lot of discussion. And with it comes a certain obligation for Europe to rearm, to support Ukraine, to build it up into a fortress. One of the challenges we've seen over the last 3 years is it's difficult to shake not just Europe, but the UK and others out of what seems to be a sort of terminal slumber to get them to take any kind of action and really scale up to recognize that they are involved, as you said at the start, in a full-scale confrontation with Russia that is perhaps far more risky even than parts of the Cold War. Isn't the danger of, putting those lines of contact to bed, as it were, is that we just go back to sleep and then we don't arm and support Ukraine in the way that will be absolutely essential to ensure its long-term viability?
No, I think your argument is correct. I mean, the idea that you can somehow just freeze this conflict, and the Germans have floated this idea, and a few others, and it's clear that the people advancing these ideas understand, I think, little about what is motivating Putin here. Secondly, probably a lot less about what the Ukrainians have really been through and what they are currently fighting for. And the fact that Russia doesn't have strong enough incentive to enter meaningful negotiations. There is a problem in vocabulary here that on the Western side, we speak about possible peace negotiations, and we imply that both sides will be ready to come to the table and understand that there has to be a trade. Now, I don't think Putin sees it that way when he is clearly very confident. He thinks he is winning. And what he understands by the terms negotiations, by the term negotiations, is simply the the um, the definition of the conditions for Ukraine's surrender, and
Capitulation. That is it, isn't it? It's
that is capitulation. Exactly. So we're not talking here about the same things. Now, if it were possible, and maybe Trump, with his transactional instincts, can pull a rabbit out of the hat and surprise us all and incentivize Putin to negotiate, then you do have the question about how do you defend that part of the Ukraine, which the Russians would probably like to get the claws into. And I'm thinking here about the second city of Kharkiv in the east of the country, Odessa, the Black Sea port. These are cities of strategic significance. So how do you, and not to mention, of course, the capital itself, how do you protect Kiev, Odessa, Kharkiv, the rest of the country, to ensure that Ukraine has adequate defense and that the country can be rebuilt? Because money is only going to flow into the country from private purses when the security situation allows it. And so I think what President Zelensky has been asking for is utterly reasonable. In the best solution for Ukraine is to have to be under the NATO umbrella. But as one of the Ukrainians I interviewed for my report said to me with a smile on his face, but I felt speaking with some authority, having been in the US for a few months, he said to me that Ukraine will join NATO when the United States leaves it. And that's, I guess, the way probably a number of people in Kiev feel about the prospect of Ukraine joining NATO, despite these constant statements of reassurance from NATO leaders that the door is open, that Ukraine will join NATO, and it's going to have an even more enhanced form of partnership and relationship. But ultimately, I think it will come down to the bilateral security guarantees that can be given by the UK and France in particular as nuclear powers. But it's going to take probably a coalition of the willing to put in place the measures required to secure Ukraine. And I am increasingly coming around to the view that to do this will require actually putting forces on the ground. Whether it's British, French, I don't think the US is going to be up for this. but we are going to have, I think, some form of foreign presence on Ukrainian territory to put the tripwire in place and to give the Ukrainians the reassurance that they need.
Is there an interim step, perhaps getting Ukraine and Poland into the joint expeditionary force and significantly ramping up the ambition and scale of that body?
Well, that's certainly a possibility, and I think we have to face the fact that Ukraine in Europe has the most experienced army in terms of the most up-to-date engagement using new technologies and real experience of fighting this type of war. No other NATO country has that. So we have a huge amount to learn from the Ukrainians. And I think a bit of humility is required here. When I hear about NATO countries, giving training to Ukraine, it's as though the Ukrainians are very inexperienced in these matters. They're far, far from it. So we will see. I'm sure much more cooperation and joint projects between NATO and Ukraine. But whether they're really going to unlock a new dimension of that relationship remains to be seen. But you can look at it this way. Finland and Sweden patiently over decades built up a relationship with NATO where they became effectively interoperable. And when required, and I really didn't think I was ever going to see this, that they would choose to flick that switch and simply say that now is the time to join NATO. So perhaps the Ukrainians just have to put themselves in that position, and then you make that outcome, their desired outcome, so much more likely. But if the United States is less committed to this organization, it takes on a different meaning. But I think the message from Trump, and sorry, I keep coming back to Trump, but it is fundamental. He's going to say to the Europeans, you know what? This is your war. You've been the free riders for decades. The United States has served you very well. It's now time to take care of yourselves. You need to deal with it. And if it's in some way we can help, then we'll think about it, but there'll be a price tag.
We won't even get into Brexit and the divisions that's created. Putin is not a strategic mastermind, but there does seem to be again something of the foresight there in that process and the impact it's had. But that's definitely another topic. For the last couple of minutes that we've got, let's tackle the other two scenarios. Ones which maybe it's because I'm too close to this, but which do not seem to be realistic at this moment. One is total victory for Ukraine. One is absolute defeat for Ukraine. At this point in time, it seems that neither of the adversaries really have the strength or capability to fully overcome the other and achieve what either of them could define as a complete victory.
Yeah, that's right, as things stand. I mean, would it be technically possible for Ukraine to defeat the Russian army in Ukraine? Yes, it would be, provided it received the necessary resources, training, equipment, money, all those things, and the wholehearted support of the NATO alliance. Yes, this could be done. But I believe that moment passed a good while ago. And it's clear that Western leaders do not have that appetite and still remain, I think, even alarmed by the fact that Ukraine might win against the Russian army because of the fear that this would inevitably escalate to the nuclear level. So some fine work done by Putin there to, I think, unnerve the US president, the German chancellor, and others. So I don't see, it comes down to how, of course, you define victory, but I think it would have to be the defeat of the Russian army in Ukraine and a recalibration of policy by Moscow. In terms of Ukraine's potential defeat, I also think that's unlikely at the moment. The country has, I think, still a significant measure of resilience in its system, ability to continue to resist. But if the rug were to be pulled, and the Ukrainians were left on their own for a long period, and they went this year 6 months without US support, this starts to really have an impact, and I think collective sort of collective loss of morale over a long period, lack of belief that they were ever going to accomplish their goals, that would unleash forces in Ukraine that would make the situation, I think, very difficult to manage, and it would be very hard to sustain the type of defense we see today. But I think we're a very long way away from that, and I don't see that scenario materializing unless our leaderships simply remain in denial about that potential danger and just think that the Ukrainians can keep going because they've kept going for months and years now. And I heard a British government representative recently, using this cliched term now that as long as it takes, we're with the Ukrainians, and I object to that type of communication these days. I think it was fine in the first few weeks of the war when we were trying to figure out what we were doing, but it's become so meaningless because we don't define what it is. And secondly, it implies that the Ukrainians can just carry on as they are and have been fighting for the last nearly 3 years. And the fact is they can't. So we need to snap out of this complacency that the Ukrainians are very resilient and will always be resilient. There might come a point where they actually snap because they've just been put under excessive pressure and they don't believe that their allies really stand with them. And to be fair, I think the UK has done a great deal to cement belief in Ukraine that they're not on their own. Many, many people have said to me during my visits that we have the feeling that the UK really understands us, unlike others. And this is an extremely important relationship for us. And now I think with Trump coming back to power in the United States, the UK is going to have to show leadership in Europe. And looking at the state of both Germany now with the collapse of the coalition, President Macron's woes, who else is around in Europe who's really got, I think, the standing to take a lead here. I think a lot is going to fall on the UK's shoulders.
Well, that's an important place to end, I think, and it probably cues up the next discussion and the potential discussions with other experts from the excellent sort of Chatham House and the extraordinary, I would say, ideas that come out of it that don't engage in political fantasy, but really try to engage with the political reality there. Thank you so much for coming back on the channel. I highly recommend people read the report. There's lots and lots of, I think, really incredibly good stuff in there, especially as you had those first-hand contacts with Ukrainian officials, veterans, and many others on your trip there. It's very important to really imbibe the details of that report. But for now, John, thank you so much.
Jonathan, thank you very much for your interest. Thank you.